All right, our next presenter has a bachelor's degree in psychology from Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville. He received his certification in hypnotherapy from Monton & Johnson Institute of Hypnosis in St. Louis, Missouri. He is a registered polysomnographic technician and assisted in diagnosing and treating patients that suffer from various sleep disorders whenever he lived in St. Louis. He is the former state director of Illinois for the Mutual UFO Network. And last year, he was the Lucius O. Farish, the recipient of the Lucius O. Farish Award for Outstanding Excellence in UFO Research and Education. He has one of the largest personal libraries of UFOs, books, journals, magazines, newspapers, case files from around the world, covering the last 65 years of the history of this topic. If you have not been downstairs to his table to see the beautiful, original newspapers and pictures and things that he's collected, he is literally in the process of adding on, 600-700 square feet, 1,000 square feet to his house to expand his library. He has the biggest collection that I know of in the UFO field. And he searches out these books that you can't even imagine they still exist. And he'll find somebody that's got this book or this newspaper clipping and talk them out of it. And so if you're ever in Albuquerque and you got a lot of time on your hands, go and see if he'll turn you loose in his library. Just an immense amount of information. So he has assisted the History Channel, Learning Channel, Science, and Smithsonian channels on UFO documentaries over the years, in addition to independent productions. And he has lectured radio and television programs all over the place. And I imagine you still have much of the world to spread your word to. So he's going to be a busy guy, I think. David is one of these researchers that I've had the pleasure to work alongside. If you don't know him from the past or never heard of him, you're likely aware of the big UFO case where the triangle was seen over Highland, Illinois in 2000, January of 2000. 5 police officers were the primary witnesses. It was made international news. If you're aware of that case, David was the primary investigator on that case. And I was lucky enough to work alongside him for some of that investigation. It was a very interesting experience. What I want to tell you about him is you will not find a more meticulous, precise, accurate, and truthful researcher anywhere in the field. He is one of the best field researchers that there is or ever has been. So, join me in welcoming David Marler. Yep.
Okay, I think everyone has heard about the big triangle seen over in Illinois, a month or two ago. David Marler, who is the state director for MUFON in Illinois, has a report that he'd like to give you now. David?
It's a little brighter up here than sitting in back. Give my eyes a chance to adjust here. Thanks, Lou. Good morning. It's gratifying to see a lot of people still here on the third day of the conference. I know it gets to be a little tiresome after hearing all these lectures, even though they are interesting. But if you can just give me about a half hour of your time, I hope to share some information with you today.
Beautiful. Before Forrest leaves the stage, I promised I was going to embarrass him by stating it was back in 1991 or 92 when I first was introduced to the Ozark UFO Conference. I had just begun as a field investigator trainee in 1990, and he said, you really should come to this UFO conference down in Arkansas, and I didn't know what to fully expect. And it's somewhat surreal to see this video from 17 years ago, and we're talking back in 91 when I first came here and met Lou Farish. And it's just rather surreal to be here, but I just want to publicly thank Forrest for introducing me to this conference all those years ago. So thank you. Okay, we have a lot of material here to cover, and I appreciate everyone being here. This is one of the most difficult time slots for those of you that have done public speaking because you've all eaten, which means you're prone to fall asleep. For those of you that know me, I throw a lot of data at you. The intent is not to overwhelm you, but more importantly to basically keep your interest because, like I said, there is a lot of information that we're going to go over. So just bear with me here while we get the screen up. There we go. That should work. Well, A lot of the speakers this weekend already have alluded to the fact that this really is the anniversary, not only the 30th anniversary of this conference, there we go, but as someone mentioned, it's the 20th anniversary of the famous Phoenix Lights case in 2017. Also, the 70th anniversary when the term flying saucer was coined, and of course the Roswell incident just days or weeks after that. But it's also the 75th anniversary of the Battle of L.A., a case which is one of the reasons we're talking about it, to celebrate the anniversary, but to also talk about some of the new information that's been uncovered, to hopefully provide some clarity. Just a quick show of hands, who was here last year that caught my Farmington lecture? Okay, wow, quite a few. We covered a lot of material. I had a lot of you come up afterwards stating that there was a lot of new material you hadn't heard about before. So I'm hoping at the conclusion of this lecture, you're going to realize there's a lot more information than what most people realize with regard to this case. Most of us are familiar with this famous photo. Most of the time when you Google this case, that's what you're going to find reference to. Before we dive into the material, and we're going to cover a lot in the next hour, hour and a half, I just want to start you off with a soundbite just to kind of help set the tone for what we're going to be discussing today. So just indulge me these next 10, 15 seconds. Imagine living in the greater L.A. area in 1942, just 2 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and you awaken to that sound. It terrified tens of thousands of residents in the greater L.A. area. This is something that you would be more likely to hear in Europe during the war that was waging over there at the time. However, this was occurring right over the California coastline. So we're going to talk about that, but that is what really awakened a lot of people that morning to the incidents that were going to play out. Now, something to provide context with regard to this case, this was 5 years prior to the Kenneth Arnold sighting when the term flying saucer was coined, 5 years before the Roswell, New Mexico incident. And so I think that's important because skeptics will often pose the statement, people look up in the sky, they hear UFO stories, so they think that they are seeing a UFO. We weren't even thinking flying saucers. We weren't even thinking UFOs in February of 1942. Keep in mind, this was even before the Foo Fighters sightings in 44, 45 in Europe and the Pacific, as well as the ghost rocket sightings in 46 over Scandinavia. But this garnered a lot of national media attention. Hundreds, if not thousands, of eyewitnesses observed these things, including reporters, photographers, military observers. The object was photographed, and we're going to do a deep dive into discussing the photograph with new information. And the object was fired on by over 1,440 rounds of anti-aircraft fire, 12-pound shells, in addition to other weaponry that we'll discuss in detail. But you can see this, mysterious object is seen. Los Angeles guns fire on wave of planes. There's a lot of different variations to this story. We're going to try to cut through the chaff and get to the wheat. But today's discussion, we're going to talk about the story, the initial narrative, the photograph, and more specifically the photographer related to the photograph, government documents, which we'll be alluding to, and possible explanations. And like a lot of these cases, and I believe my friend and colleague James Clarkson referenced this yesterday, more often than not, we can't say what it was, but we can eliminate what it wasn't. And so we're going to go through a process of elimination. Before we do that, let's talk about the initial story for the one or two people in this room that haven't probably heard of this case. Again, 2 months after Pearl Harbor, 1941 equivalent of 9/11. It rocked the nation, and it ultimately ushered us into World War II. Devastating attack by the Japanese military. And again, this was in the wake of that attack. And this is a Saturday Evening Post. You probably can't see the date there, February 21st, 1942, just days before this incident. And vigilance was the key word. The Japanese had attacked Hawaii. Now we were expecting a full assault on the West Coast. And so anti-aircraft batteries were in place. Searchlights were put in place in preparation for what we felt might be an imminent attack on the West Coast. So The Japanese actually did attack, sort of. Nothing significant by any means, but you can see the headline: submarine shells Southland oil field, sub shells California, sub shells California coast. To provide some context into the actual Battle of L.A., just days before, specifically February 23rd, 1942, in the evening hours, just north of the area that we're going to be talking about, here's Los Angeles and Long Beach. Up the coast here near Santa Barbara was the Elwood oil fields, and here's a vintage photograph showing you the oil derricks right off the coastline. These were the target of a Japanese sub, pictured here, and this is a very unique submarine, which we're going to talk about in greater detail towards the end as we look at possible explanations. 13 shells were fired from the submarine along the coastline, targeting these oil fields. 4 of the shells were duds, and the firing occurred over a full 30 minutes. Interesting thing is the attack began at 7:05 p.m. 5 minutes prior, FDR was giving a radio address describing the state of the war and the state of the Japanese military. And then 5 minutes into his speech, they start shelling California. A Japanese B-1 submarine pictured here with the designation number I-17, which was 357 feet long. And very interesting, 1942, this submarine actually had a watertight hangar where they could actually wheel a plane out and they would catapult launch a reconnaissance plane right off the deck of the submarine. Fascinating technology when you think about that in 1942. The reason I mention that is we're going to come back to that when we look at possible explanations for the object seen later that week. These are some of the original photos which I have down on my table along with the newspapers that Forrest referenced in the introduction. And these are just showing you some of the areas of damage. One shell came very close to a large gas storage tank, and here's some damage done to some sheet metal. But the damages sustained from this quote-unquote attack: cracked casing on an oil well pump, splintered catwalk railing, sheet iron covered shed that you can see peppered in the previous photo, plank deck and timber of a pier, which you can see here, that was damaged. Total estimated damage, $500. Now, but hold your laughter because it really gets funny here. Despite the minor damages, Radio Tokyo, the Japanese government, broadcast the following news account to the Japanese people in the wake of this attack. The U.S. War Department officially announced that Santa Barbara, California was devastated by enemy bombardment. The U.S. is not publicizing this damage, however, for fear of the impact on the minds of the public. So the reason I mention this is not just for comedy relief, but I want you to remember this. The Japanese military took credit for this, despite the minor damage sustained. Remember that as we move forward into our discussion on the Battle of L.A. Well, less than 36 hours later, the main subject we're going to talk about hit the papers. Pacific Coast's fire on unidentified planes. Army confirms air raid scare. Enemy ship over L.A. Enemy aircraft fired on by Los Angeles defenders. It's almost surreal for those of you that have seen the original newspapers I have downstairs and to read these. I mean, how often do you see a headline like that? You know, battle over L.A. It just seems like something out of a movie. But it really did happen. And the area in question was the Santa Monica area, the Los Angeles area, including Baldwin Hills, Huntington Park, Signal Hill. Anybody from California here? L.A. area? Wow, we got a few hands here. You guys know this area better than I do. So all the way down to Long Beach. So this is the area in question where all of this activity that we're going to describe occurred. The one thing I like to point out, you're going to see conflicting news accounts in the newspapers downstairs as well as some of the ones that we're going to see here today. Hysteria was definitely a component, and many of the skeptics out there will discount the entire affair and just say it was just simple war hysteria. But there were reports of fighter planes, but based on my research, there were no fighter planes in the air that night. Reports of bombers being seen in the skies. These aircraft were reportedly seen flying in very tight V formations. And there was even an account of an aircraft downed by anti-aircraft fire. The one thing I like to point out, though, just because there was an element of hysteria on that morning, I don't think we can summarily discount all of the reports. And we're going to look at that because we go beyond just eyewitness testimony. We're going to talk about radar confirmation associated with this case, which really raises the bar as far as credibility. So my working hypothesis as we move forward today, we're going to focus on the scenario of an individual unidentified object, not flights of planes and bombers and things of that nature. We're also basing this on the CBS News radio broadcast, which we're going to listen to, which described a singular object moving over the greater LA area that morning. And we're also basing this on a solitary radar target that was picked up by military on that morning. And also the photograph. The photograph shows one anomalous object. And again, we're really going to kind of cut through all of the misperceptions associated with that photo today. So real quick, the timeline, just to kind of give you some temporal perspective on what transpired on that morning. 1:44 a.m., radar detected an unknown target from the direction of Santa Maria, which is to the northwest of the greater LA area. 2 a.m., target was within 120 miles west of LA. 2:06 to 2:27 a.m., the target was tracked to within 3 miles of Los Angeles. 2:15 a.m., anti-aircraft crews were put on alert. 2:22, blue signal ordered by the regional controller. 2:25, red signal or blackout was ordered by the regional controller. 2:27, radio silence ordered by the regional controller. And 2:32 a.m., anti-aircraft crews put on green alert status number 1. In other words, they're ready to fire on any targets. So we're going to talk about the government documents, the newspapers, but one of the best accounts is an audio file, which many of you may have heard on the internet. And this is the report of CBS reporter Byron Palmer, pictured here. And just real briefly, let's listen to this. This was on the very morning of the event.
The news of the world, Wednesday, February 25th. Once again, Columbia's correspondents in world capitals and in the fighting zones in the Western Pacific are ready to give you the latest news direct by shortwave radio.
And now for news of our own West Coast, we take you to Los Angeles and the report of Byron Palmer.
Anti-aircraft guns went into action against unidentified aircraft in the Los Angeles area shortly after 3 a.m. Pacific wartime this morning. The anti-aircraft guns began barking during a blackout ordered by the 4th Interceptor Command at 2:25 a.m. The unidentified object, which some sources thought might be a blimp, moved slowly down the Pacific coast from Santa Monica and disappeared south of Long Beach. Army officials declined to comment on the possibility that the object might have been a blimp. However, it required nearly 30 minutes to travel some 25 miles, far slower than an airplane. Watchers on the rooftop of the Columbia Broadcasting Building in the heart of Hollywood could plainly see the flashes of guns and searchlights sweeping the skies in a white arc along the coastal area. Concussion of the shells could be felt in downtown Los Angeles, 15 miles away. U.S. Army planes quickly took to the dark skies, but whether they contacted the object has not been announced. Army officials say they will not comment until they receive a full report of the action. Although some watchers say they saw airplanes in the air, semi-official sources say they probably were the U.S. Army's pursuit. Several observers say they saw one or more planes spotlighted by 20 or 30 searchlights. The object moved southward, presumably over Huntington Park at the western edge of Los Angeles, and on southward to about Long Beach on the coast. By 3:30 a.m., observers said the object appeared to be over the south of Long Beach. Searchlights closely followed the object down the coast and kept it centered in their glare. Shells frequently could be seen bursting near the object, but none appeared to hit it. The shooting stopped about 3:30 a.m. Approximately 20 minutes after the firing died down, the ship returned and headed westward from Long Beach toward Santa Monica. The guns went into action again, hurling round after round of shells at the object. The second barrage appeared to be closer to downtown Los Angeles, since watchers could hear the concussion of the guns more clearly, and the flash of bursting shells was brighter. Then the ship disappeared for the second time over the ocean. We return you now to CBS in New York.
So just one point of clarification, you heard him reference the aircraft that were sighted, and they state that semi-officials thought it might be the U.S. Army's pursuit. We're going to talk about that as we look at some of the government documents. They did not have any planes in the air on that morning. So again, there was some hysteria, there were some misperceptions that were taking place, and we're going to look at that. But again, the area in question, from 2:25 to 7:21 a.m., there was a blackout along the entire southern California coast. So imagine, half of California plunged into darkness on that morning. Again, something that I think we need to take into account, which the skeptics never touch on, and I presented this at the Open Minds Conference about 2 months ago, and it was funny. I brought up this point that the skeptics never addressed the radar data in this case because they all think it was due to hysteria or a balloon, and this just doesn't happen to fit in with that theory. After that conference, a skeptic on a blog site, kind of critiqued my presentation and demonstrated exactly what I said. He never made reference to the fact I brought up this radar data information. So it just goes to show that they stick to the same playbook. But as we can see here, at 1:44, an SCR-268, which was the first United States Army short-range radar, picked up an unidentifiable aerial target confirmed by two 270s, which are long-range radar. At 2 o'clock, there appeared on the Information Center's operation board an unidentified target 120 miles west of Los Angeles, and it even goes on to state, well tracked by radar by First Lieutenant Kenneth R. Martin. Then another memo states at 2:06 to 2:27, 25th February, an unidentified target was picked up and tracked within 3 miles of the Los Angeles area. This target was picked up originally by one of our SCR-268s and confirmed by the SCR-270s. Major Milton E. Durham is on record stating, quote, as the target approached from the Santa Maria area, still well tracked, unquote, the anti-aircraft batteries were put on alert. Here's Los Angeles, and here is Santa Maria, so we actually not only have radar confirmation, but we have a much better idea of the direction this target was coming in from. So it was actually coming in from the northwest, moving to the southeast, towards the greater Los Angeles area. So this was the track of the unknown target. Again, the radar, here's the SCR-268 short-range radar and SCR-270. And what's interesting is the SCR-270 was the same radar array system that picked up the inbound Japanese planes getting ready to attack Pearl Harbor just 2 months prior. Now, this is a rather busy slide, so I ask you to bear with me, please, but I wanted to try to put all of this information together to truly paint a picture of what's going on. Here's the famous photo. This little yellow dot right here, here's the downtown Los Angeles area, here's Santa Monica, here's Culver City. This yellow dot right here is where we estimate this photo was taken in the Baldwin Hills area, just to the southeast of Culver City. The inbound radar track was coming in from Santa Maria. It then apparently moved inland over Culver City, Baldwin Hills. Then, according to all of the testimony, the object moved to the south of Los Angeles over Huntington Park, which Byron Palmer alluded to in the radio broadcast. And then the declassified government documents reference all of these little areas marked in blue. And these correlate with the initial path of the object, which then moved south and disappeared over Long Beach on the coast. And then, 20 minutes after the firing died down, a second flight came in, possibly the same object, or a similar object, moved in south, closer to the greater Los Angeles area, according to Byron Palmer and eyewitnesses, then basically reversed direction and disappeared back off the coast of Santa Monica. Now, we also have reports along the coastline here, Manhattan Beach, El Segundo, Hermosa Beach, and Redondo Beach, where there may have been a secondary object, but unfortunately we don't have the radar necessarily that correlates with that. And again, just focusing on one object moving inland based on all the eyewitness testimony, this is what we're focusing on today. But I just postulate that there may have been a secondary craft moving down the coastline. Now, the military groups involved, all of these are referenced in the declassified government documents. I don't need to read those, you can see those. Different artillery brigades, Coast Artillery Battalion, Battery B of the 205th Coast Artillery. All of these were involved in this chaos that occurred on that morning. Now, talking about military groups, like I said, the fact of the matter is, despite the eyewitness reports, no planes were sent up on that morning. This is a transcript of a conversation on March 7th, 1942, between U.S. Army General John DeWitt and Major General Searles. And there's General DeWitt, and in the memorandum, he states, the question has been asked several times why pursuits were not sent up. The reason was that we didn't have much pursuit, and this is really amazing when you think about it, just 2 months after Pearl Harbor. We had 15 planes in 3 different places of a total of 45 that were defending the West Coast. If that was a reconnaissance, meaning the object that they had seen, if that was a reconnaissance plane preceding a carrier attack, we did not want to have our pursuit in the air half out of gas when the main attack came in. We didn't want to take that chance. And so that was the rationale. Now, the memo goes on to state that pilots were in their aircraft, fueled up, ready to take off at a moment's notice if they saw an imminent attack following this apparent reconnaissance plane. Now, the military ordnance involved, we have 3-inch anti-aircraft guns that fired 12.8-pound shells. We also have 37 millimeter rounds that were fired that morning. This is my friend and colleague Ben Hansen at the Fort MacArthur Museum, and there he's holding some of the 37 millimeter shells next to one of the vintage guns that they would have used at the time. And then in addition to that, we also had 50 caliber rounds, and that's just an example of what the 50 caliber guns would have looked like at that time. So we're pumping a lot of metal into the sky at this object as it's slowly cruising along the greater LA coastline and into the LA area. So here's one of the newspapers. I have the original downstairs. 1,430 of these were fired from ACAC guns. You're going to hear anywhere from 1,420, 1,430, 1,440. You'll hear different numbers danced around. I'd just like to say there was a lot being fired that morning. I don't think we have to get too bogged down on the numbers. But again, here's some of the guns that were used, and here is some of the subsequent damage that was discovered as a result, because, you know, going with gravity, what goes up must come down. They had a hell of a lot of shrapnel coming down on homes, on animals, on cars, just raining down. I would actually argue we caused more damage as far as dollars than the Japanese attack 36 hours before, because that was only $500 in damage. But all joking aside, the one thing I like to point out with this is people did die that morning, and I wanted to put their names up here just to kind of remember them on the 75th anniversary. At least 5 people died. Sergeant Engelbert Larson with the Long Beach Police, he had a vehicular accident and was killed. Mrs. Beulah Klein had a vehicular accident. Jesus Alcerez had a vehicular accident. Henry Ayers and George Weil both had heart attacks from the chaos and the stress and the anxiety that was going on. The anti-aircraft sirens, the anti-aircraft explosions, you know, hot metal raining down on the city. And many of these people were trying to drive during the blackout, which is probably not the safest thing to do. But I do want to mention the fact that, all joking aside, people did lose their lives in this entire series of events on that morning. Now, all of this chaos, all of this weaponry being used, radar, tens of thousands of eyewitnesses seeing something in the sky, what was the official explanation? And I'm not going to say weather balloon. The conflicting explanations, because there were two, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox stated it was just a false alarm due to jittery war nerves. And here you can see some of the newspaper headlines from San Francisco Chronicle, Los Angeles Times. Jumpy nerves, jump the gun, Knox says. Knox indicates raid, just jittery nerves. Another one? It's not we have one explanation, we have two explanations. Secretary of War Henry Stimson stated that there were actual aircraft involved, and he even stated up to maybe 15 spy planes flew over the greater LA area, and the alarm was real, and that the military personnel did fire on something on that morning. So you have two different official explanations. So frustration was abound, and I came across this article, and I love when you find little humorous little things like this going through the microfilm in the archives. This was a New York Tribune cartoon saying when doctors disagree. Here you have Dr. Stimson of the Army and Dr. Knox of the Navy feeding this guy two different pills, saying false alarm, no, it was 15 enemy planes. And this is the general public basically saying, I can't swallow both of them. And beyond the general public and the frustration that the general public was dealing with, Congress was demanding answers. I mean, you can imagine this. Imagine if this was playing out today. People would demand answers. And Leland Ford, who was a state representative, Democratic state representative, was demanding a congressional investigation because they were being fed the same two explanations, conflicting explanations that the public were. And so the raid inquiries demand in Congress, Ford demands Stimson quizzing on coastal gunfire. And no surprise, it didn't stop with Congress. It went all the way to the top. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was wanting answers. He wanted to know what was going on the West Coast. And no surprise, we have some declassified government documents through the National Archives. And this is one of the most popular documents. It states unidentified airplanes other than American, Army, or Navy planes were probably over Los Angeles and were fired on by elements of the 37th Anti-Aircraft Brigade between 3:12 and 4:15 a.m. These units expended 1,430 rounds of ammunition. As many as 15 planes may have been involved, flying at various speeds from what is officially reported as being very slow, which is important to what we're going to be talking about later, to as much as 200 miles per hour and at elevations of 9,000 to 18,000 feet. No bombs were dropped, no casualties among our troops, no planes were shot down, and no American Army or Navy planes were in action at the time. And that's again from the War Department records at the National Archives. Well, despite all of this, I mean, this is a pretty dramatic event. UFOs aside, just from World War II history, military history, this is a very significant event. You know, wartime hits mainland United States. But 25 years elapses. We continue with the war effort. We conclude the war. We win the war. 25 years goes by, and people virtually forget about this case. It was just lost to memory. But then in 1967, it appeared in Flying Saucer Pictorial Magazine, published by Max Miller, an article by Kenneth Larson, and he actually did a full 2-page spread and brought up to life the photo that was taken on that morning. And of course, the photo is what captures a lot of people's interest in this case. But shortly after that, Mysteries of the Skies, a book published by two leading NICAP, National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomenon investigators, did a chapter on the Battle of L.A. that actually went into greater detail than the initial Kenneth Larson piece. And Gordon Lohr and Harold Deneau did a fairly comprehensive write-up and cited many of the newspapers and government documents from the time. My initial introduction was my friend and colleague Timothy Good, this is us pictured several years ago at one of the conferences here. But in 1987, of course, his landmark book, Above Top Secret, he includes a very rough negative or photo of the famous photo in his chapter, and he writes about the Battle of L.A. briefly. And then in 92 and 2010, another book by Mr. Terence Sword was written called The Battle of Los Angeles. Now, you can see the photo on the cover, but as if we don't have enough confusion with the photograph, which we're about to get into, if you look at the blow-up here, there's clearly a Photoshop or doctored version of the original image. If you compare this to the actual photo, this is much clearly defined as a saucer with a little dome on top. So there's been a little bit of editing, if you will, or creative license with regard to the photo for the cover. So with that, let's talk about the photograph, because it captures a lot of people's imaginations. You see it on the internet, but there's a lot of misinformation surrounding this photograph. And I've done a little bit of research with the help of Ben Hansen, and we've pieced together a lot more information and may even know a little bit more about the provenance of the photo. So there were photos taken that morning. That was not the only photo. Obviously, with all of this ensuing chaos, reporters are out there, and they're probably snapping their cameras like mad, trying to capture everything from what's in the sky to the military response on the ground. These are some of the photos I've found. This is from an International News Service wire, February 25th, 42. You can see the searchlights, and you can probably see a lot of, tracer bullets or ammunition being thrown up there. Here's another photo. This one's from Life magazine, March 9th, 1942. And here's another one. This was an AP News Service wire photo, and Associated Press dated February 25th. And here you can see searchlights and apparently some type of tracer fire going up from this location here. So there were other photos. There wasn't just one. But most of these capture the searchlights. And here, again, courtesy of Ben Hansen, is one of the vintage searchlights that was used that generated these intense searchlight beams that were piercing the darkness that morning. Now, let's talk about the photo. We're not interested in those photos. We're interested in the photo, right? The one with the famous image. And this is a fairly clear image. This is actually the one which I have downstairs, and we're going to talk about that. And this one is a Los Angeles Times photo dated February 25th, 1942. Now, historically, up to this point, it's been alluded to, it's been suggested, but nothing definitive, that it's possible that Mr. Paul Calvert, who was a photographer with the LA Times, may have taken the photo. And a lot of that was based on Bruce Maccabee's initial research. And here's a photo, a vintage photo of some of the Los Angeles Times photographers. And the gentleman right here, blow that up for you, that's Mr. Paul Calvert. And it was alluded to the fact that perhaps he took the famous photo. The main reason that they jumped to that conclusion was the negative was actually found in a series of other negatives known to have been taken by Mr. Calvert, but nothing attributing him specifically. So the photo location, we believe it was taken around the Baldwin Hills area, and this is what the area looks like today. This is based on Ben Hansen and his research, but Ben believes that this is the ridge line seen in part of the photo. Now, over the years, you've had a major highway go through here. I mean, obviously, we're talking 42 before the interstate started plowing their way through some of these areas. But just to superimpose the image for you, this is where Ben believes the photo was taken, was in this area. So it kind of gives you a modern-day context, potentially, for where this actually occurred. But you can kind of still see the ridge line here, and it conforms generally with what's there. Again, there was some terraforming done where a lot of this was leveled out to make way for the interstate through here. But just want to show you that just to kind of give you a modern-day reference. Now, again, this is the photo as it appeared in the Los Angeles Times. And this is the one that you've seen, and we have an original copy downstairs. And just to blow this up, the caption says, "Seeking out object. Scores of searchlights build a wigwam of light beams over Los Angeles early yesterday morning during the alarm." This picture was taken during the blackout, which shows 9 beams converging on an object in the sky in Culver City area. The blobs of light, which show at the apex of the beam angles, were made by the anti-aircraft shells. So you have all of these shells exploding in, on, or around this object. Here we have another photo, and this is a woman that happened to get up because she heard of all this noise, the explosions, the anti-air raid sirens. She happened to get up, and minutes after getting up out of bed, a piece of shrapnel ripped through her roof and punctured the pillow where her head was lying just minutes before. Talk about a close call. But the reason I show you this is this caption right here, AP photo. In most of the newspapers from that morning, they were trying to gather this information together, and they're pulling disparate photos from various sources and putting it together into a photo montage, which are published in some of the newspapers like we have downstairs. So my point being is that even though this says that the famous photo was a Times photo, we have a lot of forensic evidence that suggests otherwise. And the fact of the matter is it might have been an Associated Press photo, and they simply mislabeled it. Now, I had the opportunity to work with the Smithsonian Channel on a documentary series a couple of years ago called UFOs Declassified. I was talking about my work on triangular UFOs for a separate episode. My friend and colleague, Ben Hansen in Los Angeles, was being interviewed for a really wonderful episode that documented the Battle of L.A. For you, those of you that have seen it, it's one of the better recreations and more factually based. But Wayne Abbott happened to be in Los Angeles filming with Ben for this episode on the Battle of L.A. He came to my home in Albuquerque the next day, and as he walked into my library room, he saw the photo, which I have downstairs on display, and he goes, "We just did an episode on that photo." I said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, you do know that's an original photo from February 25th, 1942. It's not a reprint or anything I pulled off the internet and printed." And he goes, "What?" And so he called the camera guy over, and he goes, "Look at this photo." He goes, "Dave's saying this is an original photo from 42. Doesn't this look a lot cleaner than any of the other copies that we've seen?" And the camera guy comes over and he looks at it, he goes, "Yeah," he goes, "that doesn't have all the smudges and the contrast is much better." And so I proceeded to tell them the story of how I acquired it, and which we're going to talk about in just a moment. But he got all excited and he said, "I've got to show you what we just filmed yesterday in Los Angeles." He goes, "We actually went to the Los Angeles Times archives and met with the chief archivist, and he showed us the original negative." And he goes, "Where did you get your photo?" I said, "Well, it's labeled Associated Press." He goes, "So you're telling me that you think this is an Associated Press photo?" And I said, "Yes." And he goes, "This is interesting." I goes, "I know we're here to talk about your triangular UFO research." He goes, "I've got to show you what we filmed yesterday." And so he played for me what I'm about to show you, and this was filmed just the day before. And let me just play this because it segues beautifully into what we're going to talk about.
The only person who can help is the archivist of the LA Times collection at UCLA, Simon Elliott.
So here's box 3178 from the Los Angeles Times collection, and this should have the negatives in it that you're looking for.
More than 4 million historic photos from the LA Times are under Elliott's care.
And there's Ben.
And then here is the original negative.
This is completely underexposed. Look at this. I had no idea it was going to look so faint. The searchlight beams, they're there, but the ridgeline's completely gone.
There's very little else to see. And then this is the photograph as it appeared in the Los Angeles Times.
The original image has been heavily retouched. In an era before Photoshop, retouching required copying negatives, enlarging details, and even painting directly on the celluloid. Is this simply to make the photo look better in print? Was the retouching meant to insert an image of something that really wasn't there? And does the original negative contain details that are hidden in the published version? Then, before the analysis even begins, archivist Simon Elliott spots something he's never seen before.
There is, in fact, one thing that I hadn't noticed before, is that you have these notch codes in the edge of the negative. This one has a completely different notch code in it. So this was clearly taken with a different stock of film.
Out of 4 million photographs in the LA Times collection, this is the first negative the archivist has seen that's been shot on a different film stock.
It is rather a curiosity. It's not something I've seen in any other negatives in the collection. Times photographers all use the same film from the same manufacturer. That this one is so completely different suggests that maybe the negative was not taken by a Times photographer.
So, where did it come from?
Well, that's a mystery you're going to have to try and work out.
The famous photograph was possibly not taken by an LA Times photographer, and the source of the original negative is in doubt. If it didn't come from the LA Times, where did it come from?
Now, mind you, the very next day, they're looking at that photo, and I'm telling them I've traced it back to the Associated Press. So it fit beautifully into what Simon Elliott had just told them the day before. So now I realize why Wayne Abbott, the producer, was so excited. So looking at that, again, the notch pattern, you heard Simon Elliott state that all the tens of thousands of negatives, all the LA Times photographers use the same film stock. So the forensics suggest that this was not taken by an LA Times photographer. Now, I have the luxury of being able to show you here a high-resolution scan of the original negative, which you just saw in that clip. You never see this on the internet. You always see the doctored photo. This is the original negative, and I'm viewing it as a positive because it just plays havoc with your eyes when you're looking at things in reverse. So I wanted you to be able to see what the actual original image before it was doctored looks like. Here you can see all the writing on the side, the edge of the negative, and again, that typical notch pattern that's not typical for the LA Times. Now, if we blow this up, here is what we're looking at, this right here. And you can see these little blobs of light. These are all anti-aircraft explosions captured at the moment the photographer clicked the shutter. So looking at this, we're going to analyze this in a little bit greater detail. Now, the photo which I have downstairs, what led me into looking at the Associated Press, I obtained back in September 2012. I would love to come up here and tell you this fancy story about how I had government insiders that gave me the photo, or I found it in some dusty archive. Unfortunately, I bought it on eBay. So nothing quite so romantic or grandiose, you know, so much for the X-Files, right? I found it on eBay, as I found many historic UFO items that are part of my collection. But obviously, you know, I have enough in my collection, I have enough downstairs that I can show you. I know what the original photos look like. I know the earmarks, the characteristics that they need to have. And the other thing that's interesting, not only the photo downstairs, not only is it the photo, but on the back it has stamped property of Associated Press, dated February 25th, 1942. And the really interesting thing, and I have other examples downstairs to show you from the collection, it has the original news teletype glued to the back, dated February 25th, 1942, with one of the original descriptions of what transpired that morning. Here's a blow-up, and it's very blurry, but note to editor, February 25th, 1942. So this was quite literally published that morning in preparation to be dispersed across the newswire. An Associated Press photo, and you know, it says caution, use credit if you're going to use this photo. And I have many, many other ones like this, so I know the characteristics to look for. This is what's interesting, the original news teletype. Now, it says right here, Associated Press photo, not LA Times. Associated Press photo, caution, use credit, from Los Angeles. How anti-aircraft barrage looked to Los Angeles. This picture shows how Los Angeles noise sky drama of the early morning hours of February 25th, in which anti-aircraft guns pumped shells into a patch of sky on which numerous searchlights converged, looked to the average Los Angeles resident who got up to watch it. The little round white dots were made by the exploding shells. Many persons thought a slow-moving object was the target of the guns, but hours later the Army still had not identified it. And then again, Associated Press photo, February 25th, 1942. So a real nice piece of history to have there in regards to the case. Now, we're talking about a case that's 75 years old this year. And I think it's interesting because really as UFO researchers, we can never close a case unless we rule out, to James Clarkson's statement yesterday, unless we can rule out that it was a prosaic explanation for a UFO case. But you know, if you have an open case and you know it's not a satellite, you know it's not aircraft, it's truly an anomalous case, you really can never close it because you never know when you're going to get new information that may come and shed some light on things. But just real briefly, and this is a little bit choppy, it's kind of like watching a Godzilla movie as far as the voice and the mouth. This is Guy Marshall. This is the man who purchased the photo. And rather than me describe how he obtained it, I thought I would let him explain it. He's an avid, as he'll tell you, yard sale and estate sale junkie. He loves to go and look at these things. Before I begin this clip, though, just so you know, Guy Marshall lives in the greater LA area, which is where he purchased this photo, and more importantly, the entire collection of photos from the photographer. And we're going to just let him tell his story here. Mr. Guy Marshall.
Okay, well, my name is Guy Marshall, and I guess you could thank my mother for my passion for going to garage sales and yard sales, because she used to take me when I was a little kid. Sell, make money on it, and other things I just keep around the house as scores, as we call them. So one day I'm just driving around, and it's a yard sale that's very close to my house. I pull up to this garage sale, and it's a husband and wife, and there's a slew of old stuff, interesting stuff. I can't remember everything, but there was a giant box or two on the floor under the table, and I said, well, what's this? And the woman said, oh, that's my grandfather. He was a photographer, and he did this and that. And I just looked at the box, and I instantly knew it had some value, some pedigree, some history to it. And I bought all the photographs. Can't remember what I paid for it. I don't think it was a lot. They were very fair in their pricing, and they had no interest in it, like a lot of people do at the garage sales when they sell stuff from estate sales, or their parents pass away, or uncle leaves something in the garage and they just want to get rid of it. And I started going through the photographs, and this photograph was in there. It stood out to me, that interesting, and looking at it, and I'm saying, well, this is going to be good. So I listed it separately. I didn't list it with other photographs. And David was fortunate enough to win the auction, and I was happy to send it to him, and we established a relationship. We share stories, we share conversation, and basically that's it.
Take on it, if you will.
Well, it's fascinating that to this day, that it's still unidentified. The photograph is really compelling. I think it says something that we can't describe or explain face today, that I'm just really happy to be a part of it as a facilitator of the story. And, you know, I think it's just a matter of time. As you know, David, I think that we will discover a lot as time goes on. 10 years from now, who knows? 20 years from now, who knows what's going to be? We're explorers, and we're out there trying to find the answers and discover the truth. That's why I keep coming back every weekend, right? And going out and doing the hunt. The score was bigger than I thought it would be. Having met you and become friends with you, and having it go to its right home, and that's important also. You weren't the only one who was bidding on this, and I couldn't be happier that you won this photograph. It was meant to be. It's just happy to be part of it. Keep up the great work, and you know, you're doing a great job, man.
So just a quick little clip. I thought I'd let him tell it in his own words, but it's really amazing. We don't know what's hiding out there, what's sitting in your great uncle's, chest. There might be a piece of the Roswell medal stuck away in a sock drawer. And, even if you did find it, would you know what it was? Even if you saw it. So it's interesting, after all these years, you can find new information. But for 75 years, we've known about the photograph, but we really never knew much about the photographer. Who took the photo? Where exactly did they take it? We have a rough idea. And so there's always been mystery surrounding the photographer. The interesting thing is, because obviously I knew Guy knew where he bought the photos from, we were able to get in touch with the family. And initially they weren't too cooperative, but I can be very persistent as an investigator, and I can keep chipping away. And eventually I was able to make contact with a family member, and they verified that the grandfather was a photographer for the Associated Press. This is actually a picture of him right here. And he was actually a photographer for many years. He was born in Kansas in 1890. He was an avid photographer since the early 1900s, worked for the Associated Press for years, lived in California in 1942, so we have him placed in that area at the time. One of the photographs I have downstairs on the back, you can see Ira W. Goldner, who is the photographer. And then he passed away back in December 27th, 1966. But he took a lot of photographs, even found his gravestone there online from 1966. And again, the photos were courtesy of the Goldner family. Now, the forensics suggests in this case that it was an Associated Press photographer, and I lay my money on Ira Goldner. The original negative does not have the characteristic notch pattern of the typical LA Times negatives. Guy Marshall's narrative regarding the granddaughter he purchased the photo from in his collection, which consisted all of Associated Press photographs. We estimate there were about 200 photos in both boxes, and each one of them were in a separate file, and each one had a news teletype glued to the back corresponding to the photograph. And there were other references to the Associated Press as the source of the photo or photographer. And again, other references that kind of bolster this contention, Time magazine, after this incident occurred, published the famous photo that you see in the LA Times. And I don't know if you can see right here, guess who they attribute the photo to? Associated Press. Another one, we have the Asheville Citizen, Asheville, North Carolina. I have the original downstairs. Here's the famous photograph, and then right here in the corner, AP, Associated Press. So we have sources from that time attributing it not to the LA Times, but to the Associated Press. And we have a lot more on the photographer. Now, if you notice, on the news teletype, you have here DRCOR. In some of these, they will often reference the photographer's initials. In other ones, they may reference COR or CORR as correspondent, as if they don't know or they weren't sure or it came through a correspondent, but they didn't mention them by name. So on the news teletype I have, it says COR. So does that refer to correspondent, or was it Charles Osgood Richardson? We just don't know. But Ira's photos that I do have from some of his collection actually say Staff Goldner, another one Staff IWG, Ira W. Goldner, another one DR IWG, another one DR Staff Ira W. Goldner. So the question remains, who is or what is COR? Is it Ira Goldner that took the photo and they just simply put correspondent? Or was it perhaps taken by someone else? I personally believe, since almost all of these had his name, that these were his photos. Most photographers back then, when you have a portfolio of your work, you don't have various other photographers' photos. This is your body of work. This is what you want to show you did. So I believe that Ira Goldner was the famous photographer. And here's some photos of Mr. Goldner. This took me quite a while to work with the family to get some old family photos, but this is him around 1942. And there's one where he's actually taking a photo of one of the famous Hollywood producers at the time. And I looked at that photo when I first received it, and I have it downstairs, the original I can show you. And I asked myself, was that the actual camera that maybe took the photo? It's like maybe we not only have a picture of the photographer, but the actual camera itself. So I posed to you that Ira Goldner is the possible photographer, but it's not 100%. But I would put about 90 to 95% certainty that he was the one, because he was there, he worked for the Associated Press, all the forensics points to the Associated Press as the source of the famous photo. So let's look at a photo comparison though, because again, we have to kind of sort this out. This is the photo that's typically shown on the internet. This is my photo that I obtained, and as pointed out by Wayne Abbott, the producer, you can see a lot of smudging and damaging and scratches here, and it's faded considerably, whereas mine is a little bit clearer. You don't have all of the damage on these areas here. But I have to point this out. This is still a touched up photo. This is not from the original negative. This is after the original negative was processed, then they touched it up, and then it went to print. So this was somewhere in the process of getting it to the newsprint. So for clarification, here's the retouched photo that I have. This is the exposure taken from the original negative. So you can see a considerable difference. There's a lot more clarity here than in the original. Now, this is fuel for skeptics. They'll say, well, see, there's really nothing there. Or what they'll tell you is if you do see anything there, it's simply an aberration based on the convergence of the searchlights. We're going to look at that. We're going to analyze each possible explanation. So let's look at the convergence of the searchlights first. Now, I don't know if you notice here, but can you see this little ray of light right here, just kind of alternating? It's shooting off at this kind of sharp angle. If you continue this all the way down, it's not actually part of this searchlight. It's coming off at a different angle. If this one continues, it's going to continue to go up like this. I believe this is a reflection off of a solid body, possibly coming from this light beam and reflecting off. Because if you draw a straight line and continue this down, it actually would not carry that far. And the intensity of light is brighter here as opposed to here, so suggesting this is the source and that it's a reflection. Now, something else to consider, so this is what I'm postulating, is that this is a light beam reflecting off the object at an angle. And this is the other thing. If it was simply an aberration based on the convergence of searchlights, how come this terminates where the lights converge? There's something blocking that light from continuing. And so my argument is there is a solid mass in the convergence of these lights, but you have no continuation of light beam here. So looking at that, let's look at this, which is concentrated, focused on one spot, as opposed to another photograph which I found in the archives taken that morning where you do have a convergence of searchlights. If that was a convergence of searchlights, you should see something like this little, as one newspaper described it, a wigwam effect in the sky. And here you have the beams obviously crossing. Here they seem to be terminating on something. And you also have concentration of gunfire. And this was from a book on the Pacific coast during World War II. Items of consideration, though. Here's a photo that was taken that morning along the coast, and here's our photo. That's chaotic, right? There's no rhyme or reason. They're just panning the sky. This is extremely focused and concentrated. And again, let me just play for you just one portion of the soundbite from Byron Palmer as you look at that photo.
Searchlights closely followed the object down the coast and kept it centered in their glare. Shells frequently could be seen bursting near the object, but none appeared to hit it.
So, and again, that's supposition based on the fact that nothing came down. There were witnesses that stated they did believe that there was actually direct hits on the object. Now, in order to get a best vantage or view of this, what I want to do is just quickly take you through. I just did some basic light and contrast enhancement on the original negative. So again, this is not the doctored photo. This is the original image. And what we're going to do is just simply darken this image to try to wash out the searchlight beams. There we go. Now, obviously, what really jumps out are these extremely bright anti-aircraft bursts that were captured when the photo was taken. But if you notice, this thing right here, and especially once we zoom in here, we're going to crop and zoom in on this. When we zoom in, you're going to see that there's a different density, there we go, between these light sources, these explosions, and whatever is situated there. There's a difference in light density. We're going to kind of highlight this and we're going to zoom in and blow that up so you can see it with greater clarity on all of the monitors. And once we do that, what you're not only going to see is a difference in light density, but in overall shape. There we go. So quite often you'll hear people describe this photo as, well, it looks like a flying saucer with a little cupola on the middle, right? A little dome on the top. The dome in the doctored photo, because it blends in, you really can't discern what you can here with the original negative. The cupola on top of the flying saucer is actually 3 or 4 explosions all detonating at the moment the camera shutter was clicked. You can see here these globular light sources. These are all explosions. You can see 1, 2, 3 here, and this looks like 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 detonations in that same general area. But if you notice, there's a difference in the light density. These are explosions, but whatever this is not part of the explosion. There's a distinct difference there. Hopefully you can see that from the audience perspective. And there's a blow up, just so you can see it much better. These are either explosions on or in front of. Again, it's a two-dimensional image, so we really can't tell depth. But there's apparently a distinction between whatever this is and whatever these are. And the only thing I'm going to tell you is, when you look at that, I don't think you're reading too much into it. Sure as heck looks like that shape to me. I don't know about you. So, looking at that, what's interesting is one of the witnesses, there's too many to go into during the presentation. One witness who's now deceased was 8 years old at the time of this occurrence, and he described the object that he and his mother saw as looking like a lozenge or a long oval. So looking at the original negative, it correlates very closely to his description, his eyewitness description when he was 8 years old at the time. Now, the closest comparison to anything prosaic, anything conventional, would be one of these little guys, or big guys. And there's a really good photo there, the anti-aircraft barrage balloons that were tethered up around the area. These things were cotton, and they were covered in rubber or latex, and they were manufactured by the Shell Corporation. And they were, lighter than air balloons or blimps. And is it possible one of these became untethered and drifted? And that's what people saw, because as you heard Byron Palmer state, the object was moving too slow to be an aircraft. So the only prosaic explanation you could really come up with was some type of balloon. And based on the overall shape that we now have with the original negative, we know it seemed to be elliptical. We're not talking about a little weather balloon. And also light reflective, to give us that reflectivity, because it is coated in this silvery color. But let's look at the government documents, because that really sheds some light on this. Now, before I proceed, Forrest made a great statement yesterday, which I want to echo. He stated that as UFO researchers, we stand on the shoulder of giants, and I completely agree. One of those giants is this man right here, Mr. Barry Greenwood. In the 70s and 80s, before these UFO conferences were really becoming very prominent across the country and the world, Mr. Greenwood spent hundreds of hours licking stamps, licking envelopes. We're talking old school here, right, before the internet. And he was filing hundreds of FOIA requests to get secrets released, to get information from the government out of their files when the Freedom of Information Act was enabled. And so he was able to garner hundreds and thousands of pages, not only on the Battle of L.A., but many other UFO cases. I was put in touch with Barry Greenwood through another UFO researcher, and Barry was kind enough to share all of the declassified government documents that he obtained, many of which we've already quoted in the presentation. But these are just some of the examples. Department of Army, General Services Administration, National Archives. This man has just tons of material. And I bring this up because I think it's important to make sure that when we talk about government documents, we talk about those that we can truly establish are legitimate. Not spurious documents, not documents that just manifest on the internet with no provenance whatsoever. One of them is this one right here, referencing the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit. And I know people have quoted this before in reference to the Battle of L.A. And this was supposedly a top-secret government group that was analyzing the UFO situation as a direct result of the Battle of L.A. incident. The problem was, it didn't come through official sources. It just suddenly manifested in email boxes of certain UFO researchers. And I'm not going to get up here and quote a document unless I know definitively where it came from and that it's a legitimate document. But in the work of Barry Greenwood, he did have some documents where people were trying to investigate this IPU, this Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit. Mr. Robert Todd, a researcher back in 1979, filed this document, which he received a reply to. It says, "Please be advised that the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit of the Scientific and Technical Branch Counterintelligence Directorate, DA, was disestablished during the late 1950s. What's interesting about this is he had filed a FOIA request simply asking for any UFO documents that the Army might have. This was the very first time we heard about this group, so you can imagine how he fell out of his chair. It's like, what? What's this? And so another researcher years later filed another FOIA request trying to get additional information, asking what was this so-called Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit. Mr. Steinman, and this is back in 1984, received a reply. The unit was formed as an in-house project purely as an interest item for the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence. It was never a unit in the military sense, nor was it ever formally organized or reportable. It had no investigative function, mission, or authority, and may not have even have any formal records at all. So, there was an organization called this, but apparently it wasn't a formal military unit in any way, shape, or form. But I think this brings up and illustrates a point with not only this case, but cases in general. You know, if we're going to talk about government documents as UFO researchers, we have to refrain from quoting these documents as gospel truth when they come from unofficial sources. If you don't know where they came from, you don't know the provenance, the history of these documents, or the source, you can't guarantee the authenticity of the information contained therein. And there's a lot of documents floating around out there. There's new ones all the time. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to be led down a false path. I want documents that have established provenance. And if you do quote these as researchers, we have to qualify and clarify that these are not through official sources. File a disclaimer when you reference these, because there's many researchers that quote them as gospel truth. And unfortunately, you know, we need to refrain from that because, you know, our arguments is only as strong as the weakest link, right? So we don't want to throw information out there that's skeptics are gonna attack us later. And you have to ask yourself, who's disseminating the disinformation now? You know, a lot of times there's false information, misinformation by UFO researchers thrown out there, and it just muddies the water. But we don't have to look at just UFO researchers. There's the media, right? There's different print magazines over the years that have spread a lot of disinformation. This one really made me laugh. This was Adventure magazine back in the 1960s, and it referenced the Battle of L.A. What it talked about specifically was this Achiro Kubata, who displays a paper talking about the Battle of L.A. incident. And in the article, the title was, "I led the air raid over Los Angeles." And what's funny is he talks about a suicide mission to attack L.A. He didn't succeed, obviously, because he lived to tell about it, so he didn't do a very good job on the suicide mission. But it recounts the tale of him, and he claimed to be on this suicide raid against Los Angeles, and that he led the vanguard of the attack against the L.A. area. But again, there's no evidence to back this up whatsoever, and in fact, there was no damage whatsoever sustained. So it was a terrible mission because he didn't cause any damage, and he didn't kill himself in the process. But I like to mention that because I stumbled across this while doing research on this. And again, this contradicts all the official Japanese military records, which at the conclusion of World War II, they stated, we had no military operations along the West Coast on the morning of February 25th, 1942. So, explanations, as we've gone through the information. Before I touch on this, I like to differentiate skepticism versus skeptic. You know, we all have to be skeptical when we investigate this stuff. Not everybody that comes forward with a UFO story is credible. They might be lying. They may embellish. They may forget or elaborate on things that they don't recall. So we have to be very careful in the facts that we're presenting. This is the one I love, though. A prominent UFO skeptic, who I'm not even going to gratify by mentioning his name, made statements about the Battle of L.A. case several years ago on network news. Some of the statements he made, looking at the Battle of Los Angeles as some kind of UFO event is pretty silly. We're talking about a case where there are no surviving witnesses, which is funny because at this very conference, about 3 years before he made that statement, I was interviewing a man that used to come here every year with his wife, and he's a retired Northrop engineer, and he lived in the LA area, and he and his mother woke up that morning and saw the object and the convergence of the lights. So this guy obviously can't do his math and understand how old someone might be from that era. Documentation is spotty at best. I would have you please come down to the table and look at the inch-thick binder I have of declassified government documents, not to mention newspaper accounts. So, and then I love this one. It's the fairy tale syndrome, long ago and far away. I don't even know what that means. I mean, what does that even mean? I don't know how to respond to that. I guess anything that's old isn't credible. I mean, that's just ridiculous. And then again, they've accused UFO researchers and believers as conspiracy theorists and cherry-picking the data to fit the UFO narrative, that we as UFO researchers were trying to find UFOs under every rock. And that's just not the case. Some have argued that the most likely explanation was that a weather balloon caused the mayhem. Again, the ubiquitous explanation, right? They added that one skeptic actually stated this on their website, that a semi-inflated balloon might have sustained the barrage of anti-aircraft fire because of the pliability of the balloon. This is insane. I mean, this stretches physics to the limit. Because the one thing we got to keep in mind, you have all of these anti-aircraft explosions, either on, assuming direct hits, or around this object. We're not only talking about multifaceted, sharp pieces of metal flying in all directions at high velocity, we also have to keep in mind these were hot shards of metal. If you had a balloon made of latex, for example, it's not only going to rip and tear, it's going to melt right through the surface of that balloon. And that much a barrage thrown at a balloon, not only once, but twice, when the balloon apparently liked to do a return flight, I mean, it really stretches the imagination. And again, let's go back to what I said earlier. What about radar? How does radar describe, or how does radar come into play when you had an inbound radar target 120 miles off the coast, which was what precipitated all this? That's why the air raid went into effect. That's why we started pumping shells at this object, because we were tracking an inbound target. Are we really expected to believe a barrage balloon detached itself, floated out 120 miles off the Pacific coast, and then meandered its way back in, being tracked on radar, only to be fired on multiple times, disappeared, decided to go ahead and flip a U-ey, come back, reverse direction, be fired on a second time, only to disappear back out of the Pacific coast? I mean, this is just ludicrous. I mean, it's just, that's great technology for 1942 for a balloon. But they never reference the radar data. And we have to view the totality of evidence in any case, and we can't simply throw out the radar data because it doesn't fit our preconceived theories or beliefs. So now who's cherry picking the data, right? They attack the UFO researchers, I attack the skeptics. So looking at that, this, like any other case, we have to suspend our willingness to believe or disbelieve. Let's just look at the facts. We have to weigh the totality of evidence in this case. My friend and colleague, James Clarkson, yesterday, we think alike. He quoted Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's character. I agree. Once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. So let's look at the possible explanations real quick. Hallucinations, war nerves. Could that have been what caused all this hysteria? There were varying descriptions, right? There was an element of hysteria. None of us can argue with that. The convergence of the spotlights are an indicator of this, that there was something there. There was focus on one particular area. Hallucinations and war nerves can't be photographed, to my knowledge. Hallucinations and war nerves can't be tracked on radar. I think we can all agree on that. So, what about Japanese planes attacking? No Japanese records were found referring to this event. Japanese Navy spokesman denied any military operations in 1945 on that date, and that's from an Associated Press article dated November 1st, 1945. Raid on Los Angeles in 1942, denied by Japs. I think the title says it all. Also, the object was described as moving too slow for an airplane, which is interesting. Byron Palmer alludes to that. And no shots were fired and no bombs were dropped by the invaders. And no wreckage was found either. So, what about the I-17 Japanese submarine I told you about at the beginning of the presentation? They did have a submarine that could launch an aircraft. Well, again, there's the photo. Here's the watertight hangar. Here's the launch ramp. And just to give you an idea, it had what we called a Glenn aircraft aboard. And here's a rare photo from this vantage point showing the plane actually taking off of one of these submarines. Really amazing when you think about that for 42. And then Nobukyo Nambu was an officer on the I-17 during the Elwood oil field attack 36 hours before. We have an official statement by Mr. Nambu. He stated in a letter dated November 19th, 1974, that their plane had made no flights on that cruise for the attack on the Elwood oil field. So we have an official denial on the part of the Japanese military, and we have one of the officers on board that Japanese submarine 36 hours before that stated that plane never flew on that mission. And again, contrary or in comparison to the attack on the Elwood oil fields, which remember the Japanese took credit for, they never ever took credit for this event. So again, there was more damage done on that particular morning than 36 hours before at the Elwood oil fields. You think that they would certainly take credit for that. So weather or barrage balloon, could a balloon of some type account for what was seen on that particular morning? Guns on coast blast at night, air raider. I love that. Mysterious object floating slowly through sky brings thunderous barrage from artillery in Los Angeles area. There's no shortage of news headlines regarding this incident. Target believed to be blimp. And so it talks about the fact that it must have been a blimp because it was moving so slowly. And so that was the zeitgeist, the thinking of the time, right? We didn't have helicopters in 1942. We didn't have the ability to hover. We had traditional propeller aircraft. So their thinking was it couldn't have been an aircraft, therefore it must have been a balloon. I would argue, based on what we know now regarding the UFO subject, is there a possible third explanation? Namely, someone else's technology in 1942 that we were looking at. So, again, it doesn't consider any other possibilities going with that mindset. Now, here's an interesting account. This is one of the official military records dated from that morning, 1942. And it states, "It was pointed out to the group commanders that in the first firing of this group between 3:12 and 3:21, a total of 482 rounds were fired. During this period, the travel of the target was only 10 miles per hour. Also, in the second firing by this group, 100 rounds were fired between 3:58 and 4:01. As a result of all the testimony which was taken later in the day, it is very probable that most of the firing of this group was directed against a meteorological balloon." And I love that, very probable. Doesn't sound very definitive, does it? It's like very probable. So, and then some people have asked me, well, what about the Japanese Fugo, or fire balloons that were deployed against the West Coast? I looked at that as a possible explanation. The only problem is those things weren't deployed until late 1944. So a little too late for this episode to even look at that as a possible explanation. And then the weather balloon came up again in Anti-Aircraft Journal from 1949. They referenced the explanation being attributed to that, but it goes on to state not one but two weather balloons were released that accounted for all the mayhem, and they state definitively that these were the source of the frenzy on February 25th, 1942, but there's no documents to substantiate that, and again, it simply doesn't seem to fit with the facts in this case. And so, you know, I simply can't accept that. No mention of the radar target as a precursor to the events was mentioned in this article either. So again, they just ignored the radar target. So, whether a barrage balloon. The barrage balloon, like I said earlier, I agree that that matches the general shape of what we see in the photo and the slow speed, but it doesn't account for the directional change in flight, the ability to hover at times, and apparently to have all this anti-aircraft fire directed at it. The weather balloon seems implausible just due to the small size. I mean, it was a significant sized object based on the reports. And again, no physical evidence of a missing or downed barrage balloon. I mean, these are fairly large things. If you saw one of those draped on a building, aha, we have an answer now. You know, we have a definitive answer. And let's be honest, let's think of the military and the government officials in 1942. They had two conflicting explanations. The easiest thing would be to come up with one unified explanation to just simply allay the public's concern and Congress's concern, but they didn't do that. And so in either case, shrapnel would have shredded and deflated either one of these, in my personal opinion. I've wrestled with maybe this being a possible explanation. I can't rectify that in my mind with all of the available data we have. Then I came across this, and I think this is an interesting little end note. This was a commentary written into the Los Angeles Times about 3 days later on the 28th. And the witness states, "Wednesday morning, a friend told me that he had witnessed the first dogfight between airplanes over America. Later, it turned out that what he had seen was a dogless dogfight, for no enemy airplanes had been seen or even heard, and that what looked like a balloon had been spotted by searchlights and fired upon. The photograph in Thursday's Times, the famous photograph, shows the alleged balloon clearly illuminated by 9 converging searchlight beams and with half a dozen blobs of light from bursting anti-aircraft shells near it. This balloon," and he has quotations there, "this balloon has a nearly hemispherical top and possibly a similar base. That it was not a balloon seems probable because the escape of no balloon has been reported, as well as because it failed to collapse under intense and apparently accurate shell fire. What then was it?" That was the question that was asked days after this event, 75 years ago. We're here today asking that same question, but we have a lot more information at our disposal. So, genuine UFO as a possible explanation. Once you eliminate all the other down-to-earth conventional explanations, I think we are left with an object of mysterious origin. We can't say it's extraterrestrial. I'm not about to say that. But I would say it's highly suspicious in nature, and I would argue that it is highly suggestive of someone else's technology. But as far as UFO cases go, let's really look at this. I mean, most of the time as UFO researchers, we get a little light in the sky report by a solitary witness, maybe multiple witnesses, but that's about all we have. Let's look at this, though, in analyzing this. It's a multiple witness case. Tens of thousands of witnesses supposedly saw this object on that morning. It's a photographic case. We have a photograph. We now have a better idea of the provenance of that photo. It's a radar visual case. We have 3 separate radars that track this in official government documentation, and we even know the direction from which it was now coming. We have military engagement. We fired over 1,400 rounds at this thing, and it still seemed to be unscathed and still seemed to fly over the greater LA area, not once but twice. And we have ample official documentation. It's not a question of did this event happen? The question is what happened? And so, as UFO cases, I like to say they don't get much better than this. But ultimately, each one of us must arrive at our own conclusions with not only this case, but other cases as we investigate them. So 75 years ago, they just recently in February, on the actual date, February 25th, hosted a celebration at the Fort MacArthur Museum. And in fact, each year in celebration of this event, they host a huge event. So if you're ever in California, in the greater LA area, in San Pedro specifically, I recommend you check that out. They host it each year, but this was the big year. This was the 75th year of the event. And so with that, I'd just like to say thank you. I don't know how we're doing on time. I don't have a clock in front of me. Hopefully we didn't go over. How are we doing? 10 minutes? 7 minutes. Hey, not bad. So I guess we can take, are we set up for questions?
Stand right there. There we go. And then look up, because the sandbag's coming down on you. I'm just teasing.
When this, I might call it a UFO, left and went back over the ocean,
Right.
what kind of speed was it at then? Did it still just float or?
They don't reference any speed, unfortunately, on the radar tracking. They simply state it was tracked. They give the azimuth, the direction from which it was coming from, but they don't reference how many knots it was moving, unfortunately. We don't have any detailed information. I want to, just like I did with the Farmington research last year, there's still avenues I want to pursue. It's just finding the time and the resources to actually pursue it.
That would make a really big difference.
I agree. But it's interesting it was moving so slow over the greater LA area to where, again, it couldn't have been aircraft as we know it.
Maybe it wanted to test, how much we could do to it, and thank goodness we didn't have nukes then.
I'm just glad we have this information. I'm glad we have this information preserved, and I'm glad like Barry Greenwood was able to get all of these documents. It made it a lot easier on myself in collecting this data. Yes?
I'm really surprised that with the detailed investigation you did, that not once did you mention the wind speed or the wind direction, which would be essential in the movement of a aerial phenomena.
And that's one, again, I work full-time, so I don't do this full-time. I want to go research further the government documents, and the ones that Barry had, he didn't have any wind speed or wind direction. In none of the military reports, which I have downstairs, I'll have you look at, they don't reference wind speed or wind direction. When I went online to look up the historical weather data, it only listed temperatures. There was no wind or precipitation records online. So what I'm going to have to do is actually go to the military archives and try to get that. But I completely agree. If we can determine that this object was moving directly counter to the wind, then we know this was obviously an object of powered flight.
I believe this was about the time that the weather balloons began to be used.
They were launched on a regular basis, actually, in that area, especially with the anti-aircraft batteries there. But very good point.
I was just wondering, probably don't matter, but did anybody ever actually take a weather balloon up there and see how many seconds it would last?
I believe Ben Hansen did with one of the productions. I haven't seen it, but he was talking to me about it, where they actually did launch a balloon, I think with a flare, and they were just trying to kind of recreate the event. But I haven't, someone else may have seen that episode. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, I can't imagine it lasted very long. Yeah, I can't imagine it lasted.
I don't know.
5 seconds.
I don't know, but thank you.
I noticed that I believe it was 122 when it was first noticed on radar.
I believe so, yeah.
And it got, I believe, it was kind of quick coming through there, but I believe it took 15 minutes for it to go from that to the coast.
Yeah, we could do the calculations on that, but there was no direct indicator of speed in the actual government documents, but we could do some basic math with the time.
Yeah, you would know where it was.
Absolutely.
And 15 minutes for 100 and something miles is pretty quick.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I can't see that.
But there's a lot more information, as the other gentleman asked, with regard to wind speed. I would like to research that further.
Well, generally at that time of day, if I'm correct, the wind would have been blown offshore because the cold air, maybe the other way around. Yeah, the other way around. It would be coming on shore at that time of day because the cold air.
Regardless, we have huge shifts in the movement of this object. I mean,
the cold air from the ocean would have been coming in under the warm air from the land and coming over. So it depends on what altitude it was.
Yeah.
But you could kind of figure out what it should have been at least.
And if anybody wants to help me with that weather data, I can always use some help.
Next marks the spot. David, in your research, when did they introduce proximity munitions in anti-aircraft?
I believe it was later than 42. I'm not a military expert, but
I'm thinking so also.
But some of the ones I talked to, they had those that would detonate on impact, but they also had timed fuses where you could gauge altitude and the time that the shell was being deployed.
And the speed of the shell once it leaves the gun.
Exactly.
Can we tell from the photograph how accurate that was?
The firing?
It appears to be very, very close to the object they're converging on. But on the other hand, that could be optical illusion. It could be far behind.
That's what I said. Like I said, we're looking at a two-dimensional photo, so we truly can't say it's making direct contact. All we can say is it appears to be either on, making contact, or in front of. We really can't definitively establish that. My contention is, with regard to the photo, we have the famous photo. I know somewhere, at least at one point, there had to be more photos of this object being photographed while it was being fired on. I find it very hard to believe that this photographer got out of bed early in the morning, went to a hillside, took one photo, turned around, got in his car, and went home. And I've talked with Ben Hansen about this. I'm sure whoever the photographer was, if it was Ira Goldner, he probably took several photos of this object, and they took the best photo and used it for the newsprint. And it may have been lost to time. We just don't know. We went through all of Ira Goldner's photos and negatives, and that was the only photo that we had. And the LA Times only has the one negative, to my knowledge.
This is just purely anecdotal, but a friend of mine who's deceased now was responsible for training young men in Texas and anti-aircraft men. And one of the things he mentioned was that the munitions, of course, were very precious.
Absolutely.
They didn't, waste it. And so there was very little actual target practice. He said they had at one point, a radio-controlled drone. It was a little air coupe. And they'd fly this thing around with a drogue chute. And I said, well, gee, you must have gone through a lot of air coupes. He said, no. He said, the safest place in the world you could have been was either in the airplane or in the target. You didn't get to practice a lot. So the marksmanship may not have been terribly superb either, and that's why I wondered about
Yeah, I mean, there's still a lot of unanswered questions, but this is what we know up to this point. But again, I hope to eventually, with research funds and time, hopefully be able to go into the archives and resurrect more detail. Specifically, my main target, to use that terminology, is the weather data to see about wind speed and wind direction.
Because the gunners would surely have had to have that information being fed to them.
Well, and back to our earlier point, there were weather balloons being deployed on a regular basis for that very reason. Because they obviously need to know about wind speed to factor that in their calculations and wind direction.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, appreciate it.